Good morning. I can't see how many people are there, but hopefully there are plenty, although I'll probably chat for a little bit because we did have an incorrect link sent out in our first email, so there might be a few people scrabbling for the next email. So congratulations if you found us. My name's Faith Lydiard. I'm now part of the Hexham Debates planning group with other people helping me too. And the first thing I want to do is to thank Caroline Westgate, who has been stalwart in her contribution to the Hexham Debates, which she started 16 years ago, or 17 now. We're in our 17th series. And she's been organising that for all those years and has finally decided she deserves a rest, which is true. So we want to thank her very much for keeping it going for so long, and hope that we can continue to do that. And I also want to give particular thanks to Paul Rogers, who's been a strong supporter of us all those years, and I think pretty much spoken at every of those 16 previous series. So I've also given him a year off, but he may well come back in the next series. And final thank you to Peter Woods, who's organising our technology, and we couldn't do it without him. A reminder that you can post questions in the comments box throughout the presentation, and we'll get to those in the second half, in the second 30 minutes. But if you want to pop them up while you think of them, in case you forget, that's fine, and we'll come to them at the end. And our speaker will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have questions for about 30 minutes. We've also just been able to set up a donation text service, just so that we can cover our technology and publicity costs. And we're also now doing 3 panel discussions, which are held in person, so we have room booking costs for that. So if you want to donate, there is going to be, in the questions section, there'll be I forgot what it's called, the thing that goes along the bottom of the screen telling you these details, but it's to text HEXD in capital letters, followed by your donation amount to 70085, and you can specify your amount there, but text will be charged at the amount of your donation and plus 1 standard network rate message. How are we doing for time? I'm just wondering whether to wait any longer. So our first speaker for this series 17 is Michael Clarke, who has also been a good supporter for us over the years. He's Professor Michael Clarke and was director of the Royal United Services Institute from 2007 until 2015. And since 2016, he's been an advisor to the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy, and is currently the Associate Director of the Strategy and Security Institute of the University of Exeter. Today, he's going to talk under the title, Can Liberal Democracy Survive the Growing Global Disorder? And when we decided on the title, there was less global disorder, and that just seems to be increasing. So I'm hoping there won't be any more added to it during the hour of our debate. So I think that's it for introductions. If Peter wants to bring Michael onto the screen. Yeah. There we go. So welcome, Michael. And when you're ready, just get started.
Okay,
with slides.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to speak again to the group at Hexham Debates, 17th series, goodness. I've always been astonished by the ability of Hexham Debates, and now on Hexham TV, to actually open up these discussions. There was an occasion, I think about 7 or 8 years ago now, where I turned up in Hexham with about 10 minutes to go. I was a bit late, and I had a PowerPoint a USB stick with some PowerPoint on it, which I'm owing to a misunderstanding, which is mainly my fault, I'm sure. Nobody was expecting it. And immediately, Caroline Westgate and her team said, oh, you want to use PowerPoint? Oh, we need a screen, we need a PC, we need a projector in those days. And I said, yeah. And they disappeared. And in 10 minutes, not 1, but 2 projectors turned up in the room that we were using. I was astonished. And I thought, well, I couldn't get that in central London, but I can get it in Hexham. Anyway, congratulations to Caroline on all that you've done. And thanks from my point of view to what you've put into the public domain in Hexham, because I've followed these debates. And I've seen some of the publications that come out when they're printed up, and they really are quite remarkable. It's one of the aspects of civil society that we take too much for granted in this country. And it goes on. There's another group a bit like yours in Kiel, the Kiel World Affairs Group, and they're astonishing too. I mean, between Hexham and Kiel, it gives me renewed faith in the longevity and the depth of our civil society in this country. And when you sort of live and work around London, as I do, you too easily forget what is going on outside London, which is of genuine importance and quality. So, can we get the first slide? Can you put those slides set in? Thank you. Thanks, Peter. So, can liberal democracy survive the current global disorder? That's the title. So, first slide, please, from that. Francis Fukuyama, The End of History and the Last Man. That was the book he produced. He produced a phrase in 1991 at the end of the Cold War, called The End of History. And of course, it went around the Washington establishment. What did this mean? And it suddenly grabbed the political imagination of people in Washington. And so, having mentioned it or outlined it in a rather vague article, he was then forced to write a book about it to make it mean something. And what he was getting at then, this question of the end of history, at the end of the Cold War, he wasn't saying, of course, that history is coming to an end, but he was saying that the current history that we are familiar with, the history of ideological struggle, is at an end. And the fact is, fascism has been defeated by war. Bolshevism and communism is defeated by largely peaceful competition, largely. And what has emerged in 1990 and 1991 is the default option. And the default option are market economies, which by and large are liberal democracies. And so in that respect, the next phase of history for the next, 100, 200 years will be the degree of adaptation to the default. So some societies will adopt it quickly, some societies will adopt it more slowly, some will struggle with it, some will do it more easily, but it's the default. And so liberal democracy and the market economy is a sort of fact of life, and the rest of our foreseeable history will be the adaptation to that fact of life. Well, that's not true. It didn't happen like that. In 1991, it might have seemed that was the case. And Fukuyama is a very good thinker, and I read his material. He's still producing good stuff where he looks at the trends in world order in various ways. But it didn't go like that. And there's been a real pushback against liberal democracies. It started off ideologically. Can we just get the next slide? It started off with the 2008, it was crystallized by the 2008 financial crisis. And that was fundamental, because the 2008 financial crisis, followed by the global recession, was a real hit, not just to the world economy, but to the confidence that the rest of the world felt in these Western-driven market economies. The Washington Consensus, as it was called, the consensus about growth and efficiency and using the globalized economies. And globalization, remember, has only really existed since about 1987, 88. It's a very modern phenomenon. And so by 2008, it came to a shuddering halt. And this is a chart of global growth since the effect of the recession. And so what the pillars show you, the navy blue pillars, that's the level of global growth, which went from before 2008, it was around 5.5%, 6%. It fell to 4% in 2010 and has bumped along at 2 to 3% ever since. The grey line on the top, which has followed that trend, is the emerging market economies, the Asian economies mainly, who are growing much faster than the rest of us. And they've sort of bumped along and have been recovering. And the yellow line are the advanced economies, us, the Western world economies, which fell from about 4% to about 2%. We're bumping along at about 2% below the world average. And of course, in Britain, we're lucky if we can make 1% at the moment. So that economic crisis is still with us. I mean, the world as a whole has just about, after 15 years, climbed back to where it was economically in 2008. And in that 15 years, faith in the economic model that the Western world seemed to offer has been severely affected. Next slide, please. And you can see that this is a crude map. There are lots of these around, but this is a sort of map of democratic as opposed to less democratic governments. So the green, dark green and lighter green, represent democratic governments, full democracies, or they may say planned partial democracies. And the red and the orange represent different forms of autocracy, the straight autocracies and the near autocracies. And, the map tells its own story, really. There are, in other versions of this map, incidentally, I should point out that the dark green covering the United Kingdom is not always observed. Some maps have the United Kingdom down as an imperfect democracy. They label New Zealand, Australia, and Canada very positively. The Scandinavian countries, they put us into the second category, which is where the United States is in this particular map. It doesn't really matter. It's a question of interpretation. But you see the basic trend that there are more autocracies and non-democracies in the world than there are democracies, even though, again, if you think about the map, Western Europe, the Americas in general, the United States in particular, and the richer world, the richer parts of Southeast Asia, New Zealand and Australia, there, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, the stronger economies are still the democracies, but the autocracies are growing pretty well all the time. So ideologically, that's important. Next slide. Just as a microcosm of how bad this can be, that's just a map of the political instability that's just grown across the Sahel. So since 2021, there's coups in Gabon, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, in Chad, and of course, civil war ongoing in Sudan. And whoever wins that civil war will be military dictators. It's a choice between two gangster dictators who are fighting for this big and very important country. And that just, you can see that in other parts of the world. It's just an example. And it's not just a coincidence. Those military autocracies support each other. And so whereas the Economic Community of West Africa States said in relation to the coup in Niger that we might intervene on behalf of the rest of Africa, on behalf of restoring legitimate government, all of the military governments in the region said, well, if you do, we'll help them. So there is a common cause between these military dictatorships that have all seized power in the last 3 years. Next slide. And this is just an example of something that goes with it. It's not just autocracy, but gangsterism. And this is just one little snapshot. On the 5th of March, 2023, at Bangul in the Central African Republic, which is deeply penetrated by the Wagner security group, the Wagner mercenary group of Russia, the brewery Castellan Mocaf, which is the local beer that's been there for years, French and CAF company, the brewery was attacked with petrol bombs and a drone flying overhead by a rival beer that had just launched, the Africa Tielo. And that beer was a new beer. It had been launched by the Russian cultural attaché in the Central African Republic, who was also the chief of Wagner. And so what they did is what criminals always do. They just bomb the opposition. They don't compete with it in the marketplace. They just physically bomb it. And the reason that I draw this to our attention is that this it didn't even make it into most of the European press. The French press reported it. The local press reported it. And most people just shrugged their shoulders. They said, well, this is what goes on. And there's a great deal more of this sort of thing going on in the world. And so here was the official cultural attaché of Russia also running the Wagner Group. And this, remember, was before the Wagner Group's coup in Russia, before Prigozhin launched his coup against Putin and paid for it with his life. That was before all of that. This is when Wagner was just operating as an independent mercenary group. And there you are. This is what happens. So authoritarianism, military dictatorship and gangsterism are characteristic, sadly, of the world in which we live. And, it's often said, like bankruptcy. Hemingway famously said, bankruptcy happens in two different ways. First gradually, then suddenly. Well, it's been happening gradually for the last 10 or 15 years. Now it's happening suddenly in the last 2 to 3 years. And it'll go on happening suddenly for the next 3 or 4 years or so. What lies behind that? Let's just move on. Let's think about some of the demographics. This is a population of the world by the end of the century. And eventually, world population will break down quite neatly into 11 billion people. It's about 7.6 at the moment, 7.6 billion. The population of the world is not growing exponentially, but it is growing. And by the end of the century, on present trends may change a bit, but they won't change that much. the world will have 11 billion people in it. And it breaks down quite neatly into 5 billion in Asia, 4 billion in Africa, and 2 billion everywhere else. So 5, 4, and 2, 11 billion. And there won't be much change in that. The big surprise is Africa, because Africa used to be, as you can see on that chart, Africa used to be about 10% of everything. When I was a student, whenever you looked at Africa, it was about 10% of world population, 10% of the world economy. It was about 10% of most trends that you could find, even though there were so many people in Africa then who were clearly on the edge of change. And what has happened in the last 20 years is that suddenly Africa has begun to, as it were, find itself as a geopolitical reality, also on the basis of its growing population and the fact that, generally speaking, with wealth, population tails off. As societies get more prosperous, they have fewer children. That so far hasn't happened in Africa, as prosperity has developed in certain parts of Africa. So African population is still pretty high, and it looks as if it's going to continue to be high. So the thing that is, as it were, new in that picture is not so much what's happening in Asia, but what is happening in Africa. So 5, 4, and 2, and that is a structural trend which will affect world order and disorder, which is why what happens in Africa is really important. Next slide, please. And this is the other element of demography, which I think is really significant. And this is human migration. And what that map shows you is that, by and large, the blue, the dark blue and the lighter blue, are the countries that people migrate to, and the pink and the red and the bright red are the hotspots, are the countries where people migrate from. And there's a couple of things to note here. One is, look at Asia. I mean, that basically gives you a sort of south-north split, that people in Asia are moving towards either Oceania, I mean, Australia, New Zealand, and other territories in Oceania, or they're tending to move towards northwest, towards Europe. In Africa, it reflects there's quite a lot of churn within Africa. A lot of societies are losing people, while other societies, not very rich societies, when you look at where they are gaining them. And that shows the way this rapid population growth in Africa is having a churn effect in the continent itself. And then in the Americas, there's some real hotspots there. It's, but by and large, it's not a great center for immigration, but there's enough in those hotspots in Central and Latin America to create the sort of political crisis that we see in the United States, and also in countries like Brazil and Argentina to a lesser extent, but certainly a big crisis in the US from those relatively small areas, which are also hotspots. And the point about this, if you put some numbers on it, the numbers both big and small. The number of people who have migrated in the last 20 odd years, so 20 to 25 years, so let's say the last generation, is about 360 million people. And that's legal and illegal. The vast majority have been legal migration, people just, say, leaving Britain to go live in Canada, or leaving Australia to live in Germany, whatever it might be. People retiring, going to live nearer their grandchildren, all sorts of things. And a small amount of that has been illegal migration. But the total number is 360 million. Now, that represents about 2.5% of global population within that period. Now, in one sense, that's not a big figure. You would expect a churn of 2.5% in 100% of anything is minor. You'd think that that's not unreasonable. But in absolute numbers, it's a big number, because 360 million people averages out at about 18 million people a year. And 1 million people coming into the European Union in 2015 caused a crisis. 1.5 to 2 million people trying to get into the United States every year causes a crisis. So if 18 million people a year are on the move, it tends in certain places to cause crises. And the point is, this will go on. This won't stop. This is a structural trend for the future, because more than 50 or 60 years ago, the amount of movement in world population was less than 1%, because it was difficult to move. It was expensive. In the old days when people went to Canada, you didn't expect to see them again. If the family emigrated, it was a big moment. If you ever saw them again, that's what This Is Your Life was all based on. Remember that? You haven't seen your brother in Canada for 50 years. Well, here he is tonight. It's not like that anymore. And the fact is that with 2.5% global churn, it's going to grow perhaps only to 3 or 4%, but nevertheless, that'll be 3 or 4 times as much as it used to be in a previous generation. So this demographic pressure of 5, 4, and 2 in the big demographic trends and global mobility will have a big effect. And of course, it's having a big effect on our politics, on the politics of all sorts of societies. So that's one thing to remember when we think about this global disorder, the demographic trends. Second thing to remember is economic. Can we just see the next slide, please, Peter? This is one of the best charts that I know of for what's been happening in the Western world in our own problem of liberal democracy. This is called the elephant chart, which is done many years ago. But what it represents is global income growth from 1988 until 2008. So this is the basis on which the financial crisis then took off. So this is what was happening before the financial crisis in that period from 1988, the beginnings really of globalization, the late 80s up to 2008 when it all went wrong. And what it shows is, if along the bottom trend is the percentiles of the global population. The vertical trend is real income growth. It's not the amount of money people have, it's the growth in the amount of money they had. So if you start at the bottom left, the bottom 15% of people had a reasonable real income growth. Their real income grow. The very poorest were locked out of growth, but when they got to 15%, they started to grow. So the next 10 or 20% of people, their income was growing reasonably consistently, in some cases quite high. But then look at what's happening to the people in the 55 to 75, 80% of the population. So that 20% between, say, 55 and 75, their income growth collapsed between 1988 and 2008. And as you see there, from the bubbles there, rising incomes in emerging economies, mainly China, and then the decline to the right there, decline in developed world middle classes. Their income growth collapsed to virtually nothing. Didn't mean that they were poor, but they were not getting any richer. And yet they existed with a booming global elite. So the booming global elite, that top 5% or so, those are the footballers and the oligarchs and the pop stars, and everybody could see living side by side with this enormous wealth. Ordinary people, good, decent, middle-class people, had no income growth in that period. And that is what produces this elephant chart, as it's called, very much set the conditions for the phenomenon of disillusionment, of failure of faith in our institutions, in our economic model. And when that model went into crisis in 2008, it pushed a lot of people over the edge politically. Next slide, please. And this at the extreme is what it comes to. The Qanon Brigade in the United States, who end up in the attack on the White House in 2021. That was their famous thing. The slogan: "We are not here to convince you. We are here to warn you. We are QAnon." QAnon was this conspiracy theory that rose up in the United States based on the idea that Hillary Clinton was sitting in a pizza parlor underneath a pizza parlor in Washington, running a pedophile ring that was capturing children all over the world and taking their blood to inject in themselves to give them eternal youth. Well, you've only got to look at Hillary Clinton's photographs to realize it couldn't have been working. But this crazy conspiracy theory then spread out into a theory that the whole of American government, and by extension world government, or what was going on in the world, was driven by a subclass of people who were manipulating the rest of us. And that the deep state, this hostile deep state, were actually at the root of everything. And that what is required are courageous politicians like Donald Trump who will root it out. They'll attack the deep state. Now, what this is, of course, is an attack on institutions, to say all of our institutions are rotten. All of our institutions are being run by pedophiles or by people who are either communists or people who are in some way criminal. And we, the real people of America and in many other parts of the world, we've got to root this out. And this has become, the right wing of the Republican Party in America has become a political cult. And what I mean by that, I'm not using it as a term of abuse. A cult is like a religious cult, is a group of people who have a belief system which is completely insulated from the rest of the world. The one thing that doesn't stop them is a good hard fact. And they are a political cult because everything they see in the world, they fit into their belief system. And that's what conspiracy theorists do. Whenever a fact completely contradicts their belief, they say, oh, well, that fact is created in order to confuse us. It's created in order to weaken us. So they fit everything into this belief system. And the point about QAnon is the extreme. But the point about QAnon, it's not that some people believe all this crazy stuff. It is that people who are not crazy believe some of it. That's the problem. People who are not crazy have a sense that there's something wrong with the institutions of the United States and the Western world, and that we, the ordinary people, are being manipulated by other people that we don't trust. And so there's a big problem there, which is all related, in my view, to the failure of the economic model that has prevailed since the 1940s and which came to a shuddering halt in 2008. Next one, please. And that leaves us leads us into the geopolitical realm. And so the world is dominated by the four big powers. They're all the big four, as I call them. They're big for different reasons. I mean, Russia is not a big economy. Its economy is less than half the size, about a third the size of the British economy, incidentally. But it's big for other reasons. It's big because it's a continent. It's big because of its military and all the rest of it. So United States, Russia, China, and India. Those are the big four. And the point about those big four, two things. One is that the geopolitical wheels between those big four are now turning very quickly. And those geopolitical wheels are turning more quickly than at any time since the 1930s, 1940s, in my view, in my own view. And the rest of us have got to define our strategies in between the turning of those big geopolitical wheels. The second point is that of those four countries and those four leaders, two of them, Putin and Xi Jinping, are overtly revisionist. They have said, they make it no bones about this, they want to change the rules of world politics. They say that world politics are undergoing a fundamental transformation, and that transformation is being driven by what we offer the rest of the world, like Africa and Asia, what we offer the poorer people in the world, or what we offer those who aspire to something else, who've lost faith in the West, and rightly so is what they say. Modi, incidentally, is now presiding over India, which is the biggest population in the world. It overtook China last year in terms of global population. And he's building himself up as a democratic dictator, which is that he will probably remain in power for a long time because he manages to imprison the opposition. And although he doesn't overtly fix elections, if you fix the electoral map well enough, you don't need to fix the election. That's what dictators do. They fix the electoral map first, and then they fix the election if they haven't done a good enough job. And he's in the middle of that sort of process. And so geopolitics works on top of all of this. And so next map, please, Peter. If we look at just a straight map of the world, I mean, working from Asia, working from right to left, it's fairly disturbing. So if we look at the in the Pacific, the Korean Peninsula, the Taiwan Strait in Taiwan, the South China Sea are all places where a conventional conflict, quite old-fashioned looking conflict, could break out at more or less any time. If we go to Southeast Asia, particularly think about Myanmar, the genocide against the Rohingyas, there's enormous civil conflict. India and China are becoming real strategic competitors in a really big way, and there's an enormous potential for great disorder between them. And again, I can go into that more if you're interested later on. Come towards the Middle East. Think about the Red Sea. There's the Bab el-Mandeb Strait at the Horn of Africa. South of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait are the countries of Rwanda, Burundi, Central African Republic, the Congo. Those countries are beset with civil conflicts. And down in South Africa, very important country in Africa, is lining itself up fairly obviously with China and Russia over a series of issues. It claims it isn't, but actually it is, and that's driven by internal issues as well. And if we go north of the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, of course, the Gaza war, the Middle East is at the moment teetering on the verge of a more regional conflict, although it might be a rather fragmented regional conflict, different sort of conflicts that are happening in one place. But that's in a very volatile state. And then west of that, Libya is in a permanent civil war. Algeria is in an incipient civil war. We've already talked about the Sahel. And then north, we go into Europe. There's the migration crisis, which is set to get worse. And the issue of Russia, the Ukraine war, which is a sort of crucible of European security now. European security is not the sort of thing it was even 5 years ago. We've crossed the line with the Ukrainian war in ways that I've talked about before, I think, in this context. And then in the Americas, the biggest security issues in the Americas are crime and gang warfare. But there's also, again, it's a sign of the times. You look at Venezuela and Guyana. I mean, Venezuela and Guyana, Venezuela looks as if it may even invade Guyana in order to get hold of Essequibo, which is the territory, 2/3 of Guyana. Why might they do that? Because oil was discovered offshore from Essequibo in 2015. So suddenly Maduro of Venezuela, who's bankrupted the whole state with his dictatorial policies, if he can grab 2/3 of his neighbor, he'll grab the oil. And so a territorial issue, which was settled internationally by arbitration in 1899, has been opened up again by Maduro because it's the only way out he can see from the economic mess he's left his very rich country, Venezuela, in. They might just invade their neighbor. And the reason I mention that is that 20 years ago, he wouldn't have even thought about it. He wouldn't have given it a practical thought. But now he's giving it more than a practical thought. I think it's a possible scenario over the next coming year. It's not inevitable by any means, but he's playing with the idea because he thinks he might get away with it. And I think he might be right. I think if they did it, they would get away with it because there's so much else going on. It's a symptom, a bit like the bombing of the brewery in the Central African Republic. It's a symptom of the disorder which we see in the world. And final points in terms of trying to analyze the problem. Next one, Peter, please. Are trends. We used to think, and Francis Fukuyama certainly thought, that one of the attractions of the liberal democratic model was that it was shown to be economically more efficient. You were just richer. If you lived in a liberal democracy, the chances are you would be more prosperous, as well as more settled and more secure. Well, that was the case during most of the 20th century, but it is less the case now. And so this is a chart from the Financial Times from a couple of weeks ago, which shows that economic power shifts towards autocratic rule. So if you look at the navy blue and the light blue trends, in 1992, on the left-hand side of the chart, 75% of the world's GDP was accounted for by the liberal democracies, only 25% by the autocracies. If you look at it now in 2022, only 55% of the global GDP is accounted for by the liberal democracies. 45% is now accounted for by the autocracies. And so if that trend continues, then it increases this sense that you don't have to be liberal democratic to be prosperous. Next one, please. And that goes hand in hand with attitudes to politics as well. This attitude towards individual freedom have been diverging sharply between the high-income democracies and the rest of the world. So if you look at attitudes towards freedom, the navy blue line on the top, it shows that the Western world, democratic world, is becoming more liberal, more economically liberal, socially liberal, liberal in terms of gay rights, LGBT rights, freedoms to do individual freedoms and so on. We are becoming increasingly liberal as we become generally more prosperous. But the rest of the world, not the developed economies, have not become particularly more liberal. They've more or less bumped along the same trend. So they're not particularly liberal on LGBT rights or personal freedoms or individual freedoms, freedom of the press and so on. They've not gone with us, as it were. And so the divergence is quite high. And most starkly, next one, please, Peter. Thank you. Is attitudes towards, when people are asked directly, do you prefer the United States as a model or China and Russia as a model? The top line is the Western world, so it comes and goes with American behavior, of course. But there is the line that people in the Western world say, well, I prefer America as the model, however much I may be skeptical about some of the things America does. And the pink line below it is Latin America, And so that interestingly follows the Western world line. I was surprised how much it did. But look at the bottom line. Look at that light blue line. That's the global south, and they start below zero. All right. So they started in 2002 with a view that they already thought in 2002 that China and Russia were better models than the United States. And now that bumps along at more or less a consistent way, but it's going away. And so again, the divergence between the Western world, who thinks that the American model is still, for all its faults, the one we would prefer, and those who actually would prefer a China-Russia model, is quite stark. And so what to do? Next one, please. A couple of things briefly. One is, I take the line, the words of R.H. Tawney, the philosopher, also scientist and philosopher. He said, only those institutions are loved which touch the imagination. We have to think about those institutions, both domestically and internationally, which matter to us in some way. So the institution might be the monarchy or parliament. Years ago, I would have said the post office. One of the institutions that we value, that we love in a certain sort of way. We'll see about that. But we all have institutions, both domestically and internationally. What about our international institutions? Does the United Nations touch our imagination? Does the G7, the idea of the G7 or the G20, does the idea of the International Maritime Organization, which exists on the Thames, just south of, on the other side of the Thames from Parliament, more or less, the IMO. It's a United Nations agency, sits there. It controls and monitors world shipping. That's an important institution. What do we think about that? Are we indifferent to it? Are we hostile to it? We need to love, in the way that Tawney meant, we need to love our institutions in order to feel some loyalty to it. And then my final points can go through quite quickly. One is, don't worry about the Third World War. Everybody says, well, with all this disorder, are we heading for a Third World War? No, we're not. There's lots of books like this one. This goes back to the 1976, I think this was, which was John Hackett. And everybody thinks about this. There's there's reason to believe there will be more fighting in the world, more violence in the world. But what distinguished the First and the Second World Wars were that those factional fighting, fragmented fighting, were united by something bigger. In the First World War, they were united by the empires. The fact that the empires of Europe were fighting meant the fighting went on all over the world. In the Second World War, and the Second World War really began in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, then 1937, the rest of China, then 1939, the invasion of Poland. And that was united by the ideology. It was the democracies versus the fascists in the world. And that sort of gave a I don't see anything that unites the sort of fighting which is going on now and which will probably increase in the short term. So I don't think we're in danger of a third world war, because I don't see what will universalize it. But that's not to say that I don't think we will be facing in this coming decade more violence in different parts of the world, because the world is changing, the world is in transition, and transitions, sadly, are almost always accompanied by violence. And so very quickly and very easily, what are the do's and don'ts of all of this? Can we go to the next slide, please, Peter? Liberal democracy for the future. What should we do? One is, this is just entirely my own opinion, obviously. We should take a long-term strategic approach, as we did in 1947. We should just play it long, which is in terms of, we've got to have faith in ourselves and we've got to believe in what we do. We have to keep faith with our domestic and our international institutions. And I can't stress this phrase institutions enough in thinking about the problems that we now face. We should help our institutions to evolve to meet the new power structures. We should actually help our institutions to evolve so that they include, Asian, African representations, that they include those interests, that the institutions themselves are flexible enough to move into the new world without breaching their institutional ethos too much. And there's some institutions are good at doing that, some are less good. And that's one of the issues that we now face. I think we should accept smaller membership of some institutions on the basis of important values and practices. So, for instance, it seems to me logical for the European Union to say to Hungary, to Orban's Hungary, look, if you can't live with these rules, step aside for a decade, leave the EU, do your own thing. You'll always be welcome to come back, but we're not going to allow you to veto what we want to do. We're not going to allow you to set different standards of governance. and use your veto. You're only 2 or 3% of the whole GDP of this unit. You're a small actor, but you behave as if you're a big one. Well, fine. If you want to be a big actor, step outside, try a decade outside. If you don't want to come back, that's fine. If you do want to come back, that's fine too. Personally, I would say the same to Turkey and NATO, although that would be a big step. But I'd say to Turkey, look, if you don't like NATO, step out of it. You can always come back later on. But if you think you're better off outside, go outside. And so I think that we have to renew our faith in our institutions by renewing our faith that we are a community of people who do things in a certain way and believe in certain things. And if somebody doesn't want to stick to it, that's okay. We're not going to break ourselves to keep them in. Universality, apart from in the United Nations, is not such a great virtue. I think we should look for the balance between economic resilience and protectionism in global growth and trade. And we need to be more resilient. We learned in the COVID pandemic how dependent we were on so many foreign suppliers. If you leave it to the market, you will end up very dependent on foreign supply for everything. And in principle, if the world is a harmonious place, that's okay. If it's not a harmonious place, then you're leaving yourself very vulnerable. So we need to make up greater resilience. And that, resilience is not the same as free trade. It goes against free trade. But we've got to get a balance in that. So we need more resilience, but basically we don't want to fall into protectionism. We've got to be careful about protectionist pressures. I think we should invest more heavily in the West, in new industry, knowledge, workforce, infrastructures. It's no good trying to outproduce South Korea, for instance, for steel, or China for steel, for that matter. That's a big topic this week. But we should stay at the high quality end of the market, which is where our comparative advantages are. Particularly in software, knowledge-based industries, but we don't invest in them. We just assume that because we have been good at them, we'll continue to be good at them. And of course, the competition is becoming fierce. So we've got to invest more in that. And then finally, sadly, I think we've got to maintain credible military forces. And that's not always been the case that we've had to do that. But I think in the coming era, however big or small our forces are, they've got to be credible, because the sort of strongman politics, the era that we're moving into, of these very strong dictatorial people, sadly, they don't only respect military power, but they do respect military power. And they certainly notice if countries, as it were, claim that they can do something that they can't do. That sends a big message to them. So if we do use military force, we've got to use it effectively and efficiently and credibly. And so, sadly, I think we are moving into a world where whatever it is we choose to deploy militarily has got to make sense, rather than just be a claim that then we either can or can't back up, or we back it up inefficiently, or whatever. And then the don'ts. Can we get the next one, Peter? So we don't rely. We should not rely on the United States always to lead, because it won't. I think Trump and Trumpism is more typical than Biden and Bidenism. I think Biden is a sort of in a way, a welcome throwback to American universalistic behavior. But I think Trump has more in common with Obama, who wanted to get out of European commitments, out of Middle East commitments. He wanted to move into Asia, which is entirely sensible for the US point of view. We can't rely on the United States always to lead, because it won't. And I think Trumpism, although it's an extreme, is actually more typical of the long-term trend. We must not play with the arguably legal and just about legal policies. We talk about international law, but we are serial breakers of international law in minor ways. We and the Americans, since the end of the Cold War, we're like a persistent shoplifter who can't stop shoplifting, minor infractions of the law. And then suddenly, when there's an armed robbery, we throw up our arms and talk about the awfulness of rule breaking and the importance of law. Well, yes, it is very important. But we are at the edge of the envelope far too often on legal issues. We should be much more mainstream legal if it matters to us. We must not retreat into isolationism, because we can't afford to. We mustn't preach liberal democracy. We just do it. Just be it. I think we may need to draw in our horns a bit. What's important is not democracy, but legitimacy. Now, it so happens that in the Western world, our source of legitimacy is to be democratic, because that suits us. That's the way our history is developed. But in other parts of the world, legitimacy doesn't come through democracy. It comes through very often tribal connections or different sorts of social organization. What we should be concerned with is legitimacy. Are rulers legitimate in the eyes of the majority of their population? In our country, we only get that through democracy, but that's no argument to say that democracy should apply everywhere. Maybe it does, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't think we should preach it. We should just be democratic, leave it at that. And then finally, we shouldn't panic. It's getting tough, but the wheel will keep on turning. The 2020s will be a really tough decade. The 2030s, we might hope for better. The 2040s, we might certainly hope for better. But we must accept that it will be tough for the time being. Last one, Peter. And, is the world going to blow up, or is the world just going to take a thump? Well, it's not going to blow up, but it is taking a thump. The global organization that we understand is under pressure. It is changing. It will look a bit different when that ball, as it were, swings back or swings away, and we have to work out where we are then. It will take a thump, but the world will not blow up. Okay, that's it from me. So if we want to go on to questions and discussion, I'm happy to respond to anything you want to raise.
Thank you very much.
Back to you.
Thanks, Michael. And thank you for giving us a wider appreciation of the nature of the global disorder than we usually get from mainstream media and its causes, and for giving us a little bit of consolation that we probably won't have actual Third World War, and encourage us not to panic. So we thank you for giving us such a comprehensive understanding, but we have got slightly less time for questions now, so we've got about 15 minutes. So I'll get straight onto those. And we've got the first one up on the screen from Hugh Grant. In the UK, what needs to be done to get back to good institutional principles? Is there any difference between Tory and Labour leaders? And there was a follow-up to that about can UK get back to setting a good example of those institutional principles?
Yeah, no, absolutely right. I absolutely agree that we've got to rededicate ourselves to those institutions that we think are important, and think about the ways in which they might evolve. And there are seminars on this all the time, meetings in the evenings in that sort of square mile around Parliament, and people are talking about this over dinner all the time. So it's not as if it's a surprise, but it doesn't get done because we've lived through, since Brexit and really since the Scottish referendum in 2014, we've lived through a sort of political pantomime in Britain. Whichever way you think about Scottish independence and Brexit, it's been a political pantomime. And what happens when we go through these years of political pantomime is that everything zeroes in on the sort of raw politics of Westminster, the raw politics of the political party, who's up and who's down, and so on. So nobody is able to focus on the bigger issues because the political infighting, to put it crudely, takes over. That's what we've got. And we've still got it now over the Rwanda issue within our present government. So whoever wins the next election, one would hope for a deep breath and a new start. Whether it's a Labour Party or a coalition that involves the Labour Party as a major player, that would certainly give the country a sense that, well, this is your chance for a new start. If it's a Conservative or Conservative-led coalition, I think it'd be a bit of skepticism, but there'd have to be the same sense. Look, we've had the pantomime, we've had our 5 prime ministers. For heaven's sake, now let's settle down and think about. Don't worry about abolishing the House of Lords. That's not important, to be honest. I mean, there's all sorts of reforms in the House of Lords, but if you abolish the House of Lords, then you change the whole British Constitution. It takes years to do it. We haven't got time. Think about, in my view, think about the institutions which matter to us. Think about how to fund them more adequately and develop them so that they, in Tony's words, they engage the imagination of our people. So there's no mystery about what we need to do, but it doesn't get done because of the introspection of the last 10 years, the last decade of British politics.
Thank you. And the next question cut up on the screen there. Michael, could you explain what RUSI is and where its members come from and its relationships are? And also there was a follow-up from that one about whether there would be more open lectures from that institution and possibly even coming up to the Northeast.
Oh, yeah. Yes, RUSI, it's the oldest surviving military think tank in the world. So it goes back to 1831, founded by the Duke of Wellington. People used to ask him, because the Duke didn't really believe in education. Like Lady Bracknell, he thought that natural ignorance was like a delicate flower, should be left alone. But people said, why do you want an institution? And he said, I want to give my young officers something to do apart from drinking, dancing, and chasing women. And so in that respect, RUSI's had nearly 200 years of total failure. But it's an excellent think tank. It's a wonderful organization. And so what it's a security-related think tank, but it's not all about the military. It also does financial stuff. It looks at financial security. It looks at money laundering, drug money. It looks at Africa. It's got an office in Africa. It's got an office in Brussels. It looks at anything with a security element. It's got a big climate program. It's got a culture program, war, conflict, and culture. And it's independent from the MOD in Whitehall. It's not funded by the MOD. It's entirely privately funded. So it's membership fees, plus sponsorship for various things. It's a typically British model. In other European countries, organizations like RUSI get money from the government to exist, and for that reason, they're not so independent, and sometimes they just get, to be honest, a bit sort of lazy because the money is always there. RUSI has to work for every penny, and believe me, as a director, I know, RUSI's got to earn every penny that it spends. So there has to be a customer for what you want to produce. You may produce things, for nothing because you just think it's important and that somebody will buy into it at some point in the future. And it's so it's independent. Are its lectures available? Some are available to anybody. Some are members only, and membership is not very much. I can't remember what it is now because having been director, I'm a lifetime member. But the membership's not so great. But you can certainly buy its publications independently. You can plug in just as a non-member to quite a lot of things if you go on the website. And we had when I was director, I wanted to establish RUSI, say RUSI in the Northeast. I wanted to establish a RUSI in 4 or 5 university locations, and I was looking for funding so we could have a sort of a RUSI liaison in universities, one of which would have been my old place, University of Newcastle. We couldn't get the funding in the event, but that was the idea, and I still think it'd be a wonderful idea if we can have a RUSI satellite, as it were, which could produce material of particular interest and relevance to the people of that, whether it's in the Southwest, the Northeast, the Midlands, whatever it might be.
Thank you. So 2 questions coming up from Mike Sawyer there on the screen. A question about Ghana being so different in the early maps to the rest of Africa, and your comment about Hungary opting out of the EU voluntarily.
Yeah, Ghana is different just because of a different history, and Ghanaian democracy is just different to the rest of West Africa. That's the judgment that is made on that. And Hungary, it won't opt out of the EU voluntarily because it can keep twisting the tail. The issue for Hungary is that there is under Article 7 of the EU, the Lisbon Treaty, under Article 7, Hungary can have its voting rights suspended. And I think that effectively the EU could, they can't easily throw Hungary out, but they could make Hungary a non-functioning member and just say to Hungary, look, if this doesn't suit you, just leave. Do a Brexit. Leave, and you can come back if you think it's better. You're better off inside. But if you're inside, then you've got to obey the rules. You've got to stick with the consensus. Anyway, it's not impossible. But of course, whilst nobody will enforce that Article 7, Orban can play games on the basis of being a small and not very important member of the 27. He can hold the rest to ransom. Of course he will. Why wouldn't he? That's what people like him do.
Thank you. And then a question coming up from Pat McGee. You seem to argue that economic decline results in a decline in democracy in the West, but economic growth seems to reduce authoritarianism in the East. So,
yes, it's a good point, Pat. The economic decline has resulted in decline in democracy in the West, specifically because of the way it's happened in the last 20 or 30 years. I don't think economic decline in itself is bad for democracy, but it has had that effect here because of the expectations which grew in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, that somehow our growth, our prosperity was somehow inevitable. That we've assumed in Europe that peace and prosperity is a right, and it isn't a right. It's something you have to work for, both in terms of peace and prosperity, and you may have to make sacrifices in those cases. And the economic growth, it's not that it produces authoritarianism, but that authoritarianism in Asia and Africa so far has also gone with rising economic circumstances. I think in the long term it won't. I mean, this is a more general point, but in the long term, I think Francis Fukuyama, although he's been proved wrong in the last 30 years, I think in the long term, I think he's right, in the sense that I think that a sort of a free economy with individual freedoms, however they're expressed, ultimately turns out to be the default. I think most societies end up coming back to that in their own particular ways when other things that they've tried fail. But authoritarianism lasts a very long time. We all know of cases where authoritarian governments have lost all legitimacy. They're hopeless, they're inefficient, and still they stagger on for years until something gives them a push and they collapse. Authoritarianism, once it's established, it goes on until it's absolutely, it's like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Autumn of the Patriarch. It goes on until the dictator's 230 years old before he finally falls over and dies.
Thank you, Mike. So next question is coming onto the stream from Abigail Basanke. How much of a problem is panic already in the UK, given the likelihood of escalation of Russian provocative actions and the examples given of Salisbury poisoning?
Yeah, I don't think the United Kingdom is panicking about Russia. I think there is politically, there's a sort of resolute sense that we're not going to get back on terms with Russia under the Putin leadership, and the Putin leadership, with or without Putin, will go on for quite some time. I think there's a general recognition of that. Traditionally, we've always had a good business-like relationship with Russia since before the Second World War, really. And although we conflict a lot, but we also are businesslike and so on. And the Russians actually, because they think that Britain is behind everything that goes on in the world, they pay us the backhanded compliment of thinking that we're sort of satanic and that the Americans are stupid and we're the manipulators of everything. It's not, if only that were a little bit true. But there is a sense in which I think Britain does play it long with Russia. And the Russians, when it comes to the Salisbury poisoning, they were quite shocked at, first of all, how quickly our forensic teams got onto what had happened. And when MI5 and MI6 got out and about in the world and said, this is what's happened, the rest of the world believed us. The Russians said, ridiculous, it didn't happen at all. The British are making this up. Well, they can say what they like. The rest of the world believed Britain when it came to it. They believe our security services because they don't often say things definitively, but when they did they believed it. And that went hand in hand with the fact that we said that the Russians were penetrating the International Olympic Committee's drug testing center, which they were, and they believed us, and they were. And the same with the chemical weapons, OPCW, the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Warfare. Their laboratories were being penetrated by Russians. They were cyber attacking it to try and change and degrade all of the samples they'd taken from Syria. And again, we said it was happening. The world believed us. So there is a sense in which I think Britain politically, I think we have quite a good grip on our relations with Russia, and they're not good, and they're not going to be good for perhaps another generation, for another 10 or 15 or 20 years. The problem we have is that we've got a good analytical hold on it, but we don't do enough, or we can't afford. We say we can't afford to do enough to actually turn the dial a bit. So we see what's happening. We're not effective enough in being able to address it, and we still rely too much on the United States to take the lead that we can sort of do something with. We're not sufficiently independent-minded, I think, when it comes to doing things.
Yes, yeah, understand. And Peter Collins got a question there about whether you've read. I'm not even going to try and pronounce all those words.
Varoufakis. Yanis Varoufakis. Yeah.
Thank you.
Feudalism. Yeah.
His view on the arguments concerning the end of democracy.
Yeah, I've not read Techno-Feudalism. I was reading the reviews of it, and I think I understand what he was saying, but I haven't read the book. But I think his arguments were sort of he's makes no bones about it. He takes a Marxist view of these things, which is fine. I mean, it's a way of Marxism is a way of interpreting history. You don't have to be a wicked communist to be a Marxist. And he takes the view that sort of techno-feudalism is a new version of Marx's the class system, and the inevitability of the contradiction of classes between workers and the business communities, that the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer, and that there's a natural exploitative relationship, and that techno-feudalism is a modern version of that inevitable dialectic of increasing class conflict. That's his, as I understand it, his view. I don't think that's, you know, I mean, Marx produced a very good analytical scheme, but he never took account of the role of the trade unions, of the way in which working people could create better conditions for themselves. They weren't always exploited by the managerial class, and and societies change in that way. And I think that we can harness our techno future much more constructively, and it does not need to create this kind of inevitable drain into an antagonism within our societies. And again, I go back to institutions. As a society, top to bottom, rich to poor, we've got to identify which institutions really matter to us, and we ought to want to commit to them, both individually and collectively. We ought to feel it. We want to feel a love for institutions, whether it's, you know, it's cricket and the MCC in my case, not the MCC, but cricket as a great institution. I mean, my life would be much poorer if cricket didn't exist. So I commit to it. You know, I commit to supporting it, as it were, to loving it.
Thank you for explaining that point. That's really helpful. I'm just going to go to one last question, which I'm going to supplement slightly because I was thinking the same about how the climate crisis fits into what you've been talking about today. Pat McGee's question is about how most green thinking rejects economic growth in the way that it's been understood in the past, and it can't continue in that way. So how does that work with what you've been telling us today?
I mean, two big points on this, I think, from me. One is that I think green growth has got to be consistent with prosperity, but different. I mean, the Washington Consensus that I mentioned was a consensus that is not consistent with environmental awareness. So, I mean, and that's got to either be replaced by something or change in quite big ways. On the other hand, green growth has got to be, as it were, consistent with people's aspirations, not to be poorer for the sake of the environment. They just want to be prosperous in a different way. And you know, that's the balance that we're trying to, or the philosopher's stone we're trying to arrange to achieve. The thing about environmentalism is that when the world is in this very conflictual phase, environmentalism always comes second. You know, and that's the danger. That, you know, if we have a really strong international environmental policy, the best time for that is when the world is more harmonious, when there's growth, there's prosperity, and we can divert some of that prosperity into the schemes that need to be developed, so that we can find this green growth sort of plateau that would be very nice to develop. When the world is conflictual, leaders will always go for the short term. They'll put environmental issues down to the second, third, fourth rank. One of the strange silver linings to these extreme weather events, I mean, there's a bit of me, when I see an extreme weather event in China or America, there's a bit of me, I feel sorry for the people involved, but I feel kind of a bit satisfied, because I think that will actually create more bottom-up demand for change. And the more extreme weather events we've got, the more it democratizes the problem. And that does act against, I think, to a degree, and it's already been seen to act against, to a degree, this top-down failure to grasp what we need to do. We all know we're not doing enough. We know that, no question about it. We are not doing enough. The more conflictual the world becomes, the less we will do on environmental issues, but the bottom-up process may actually create more pressure that our leaders can't get away with that. And where that will take us, I'm not sure. So I think there is a silver lining to the extreme weather events that we have, but the green growth agenda is something that we've got to develop, because there's no, you know, the Washington Consensus won't do. We have to find a new one. Yeah,
I agree. I think you're right that it's a distraction, but our leaders aren't understanding that it's
they know it. I mean, they know it. They talk about it all the time, but they don't do it.
Yeah, and you're right. The reality of the climate crisis is more likely to grab attention. So thank you so much, Michael, for your presentation, for handling all those questions so well. And thank you for everybody who's been tuning in. We've had about 60 odd people while we've been live. Just a reminder that this debate is also recorded, so you can recommend it to your friends if people want to listen to it another time. And I'm just going to introduce the next debate, which will be on Saturday, the 10th of February, again at 11 o'clock online. And that's going to be Rupert Reed, who's now the co-director of the Climate Majority Project. And he'll be talking about, is there a climate majority? realistic reflections on where we are and where we should be, which actually seems to tie in quite well with that last question and answer there. So thanks again, Michael. Great to have you. And there is that little ticker going along the bottom there if people would like to make a donation by text to the Hexham Debates. So thanks again, and hopefully see you all in February.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.